Well, hello, this is Gordon Gee, and I just want to welcome you to something that we now loosely call a pop-up podcast, and this is my first one. The reason we're doing the pop-up is the fact that things are moving so fast and the world is changing so quickly that rather than having a continuing podcast, we want to try to focus on the issues of the moment. And as many of you have followed me, you know that I, after 45 years as university president, have had my First Amendment rights restored. And so I'm really anxious to be able to talk candidly about issues that I believe are confronting our higher education system, our students, confronting our national identity, confronting our democracy. I think these are all issues that are of paramount importance in this really existential time. So let's start off by something that I know very intimately, and that is Brown University. I was the president of Brown. Wonderful campus, wonderful community. Providence is a fabulous college town. But tragedy struck at Brown, a shooting on campus that killed two students and injured nine others. And just days later, we learned that an MIT professor was shot to death at his home. So first, let me say that obviously I'm very concerned about that community, and I have extended my condolences to Christine Paxson, who is the president there. I offered to come up if it would be helpful, one of the former presidents, to be there to try to provide solace. But the most important thing is right now I have those folks in my thoughts and prayers for certain. But in the wake of the Brown incident, I received many questions from colleagues across the country asking, "How do you think, what causes situations like this, and how do you think about it? How do we prepare? How do we respond?" And so I want to do something in a very timely fashion while these events are still fresh in our minds, and certainly fresh in my own mind, to try to be constructive and helpful. Um, to do that, I've asked two really wonderful experts. I think that that's one of the nice things about being who I am, is I can call on some of the very important people to come and think about this together and respond to these challenges. Our goal in this conversation is not to critique Brown or its administration. I would never do that, because I think that in today's world would be very unfair. But what we want to try to do is we want to try to think about what we can learn from this, and why is this happening, and what can we now tell people about how we can start responding in a way that is constructive and ultimately defeat some of this terrible evil that we're seeing. And so joining me today are two people, both of whom have had a lot of experience in crisis and issues management, and risk avoidance, obviously, in higher education, which is something that we try to talk about a lot, not as effectively as we possibly should. Larry Zacarese is the vice president for enterprise risk management and chief risk officer at the State University of New York at Stony Brook. He has engineered what many believe, and I join in this, as one of the most far-reaching and important approaches to risk management on any campus in higher education. And I can tell you that is immensely important. Larry is a lawyer, a former police chief, and is a nationally recognized law enforcement subject matter expert. He brings deep knowledge. This is what's important. This is not guesswork. He brings very deep knowledge and experience to his work, but more importantly, has put things into place that are aimed at managing very complex situations. And let me just say to all of you that universities are among the most complex institutions in the country, with so many different moving parts. Jeff Hunt, who is with us, is principal and founder of Legend Labs. I, by the way, know a lot about Legend Labs because I think it's one of the leading groups of its kind in this country, and I had the privilege of serving on their advisory board. Jeff literally wrote the book on crisis and issues management across the board. He worked on the Fukushima, I'm going to get that right, nuclear disaster for years. He was involved with Penn State in the aftermath of Jerry Sandusky. He's been deeply involved over the last 18 to 24 months with many of the most important things that have been happening on our campuses. And so I've got two wonderful people here. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, well, good. Jeff, before we dive in, you've been involved in so many crises in and beyond higher education. Uh, try to put this in context. What does all of this mean right now?
Well, let me start, Gordon, by really applauding you for saying that we're not going to critique, the role that Brown has been, handling, and how Brown has been handling this. Because one of my longtime mentors, Harold Burson, ingrained in me from the outset that, unless you're in the room with these people and you're confronting the facts the way they're confronting them, you really have no business trying to armchair quarterback, speculate, or second guess how they're handling it. So I think the approach that you've suggested, which is to say, based on what we know, what are some of the best practices that we think might be applied? And I think that's a very healthy approach. The first thing that I would say is anytime we see a crisis, whether it's in higher education, Fukushima, or anywhere else, a natural vacuum gets opened. And we know that nature abhors a vacuum. And we know that the vacuum will be filled. And so the question becomes, are we going to fill the vacuum or are we going to let it be filled for us? Now, the inclination, by the way, particularly early on in these situations where there's so much unknown, is to really want to collect all the facts before you say anything. So I think that that's a natural instinct, but in fact, there are things that you can say in the earliest moments of a crisis that begin to demonstrate your commitment to being as transparent as you can be. And by the way, I think people will generally give you the benefit of the doubt that you can't know everything. So to take it out of higher education, if my plant blows up, I might not be able to tell you precisely what caused the plant to blow up. I might even be able to confirm how many people were killed. But there are a lot of things I can tell you about the plant. I can tell you what we were manufacturing in the plant. I will tell you about our safety protocols. There are any number of things that I can communicate to you that begin to suggest to you that I'm going to be as transparent as I can be. So with that as a backdrop, I would say that there's kind of five key principles. And some of these you see playing out at Brown and at MIT. And the first is authenticity. In this day and age, people really want to hear from people, experts. They don't want to hear from the company said or the institution said. So authenticity is very important. Second is transparency, as much transparency as you can have, and even when there's a lot of unknowns. Third is speed. These things unfold really quickly. We don't live in a 24-hour news cycle. We live in a nanosecond news cycle. And so your ability to move as quickly as possible. And by the way, we'll come back to this later, but that generally means anticipating some of these things. So I would say that probably all the people that are listening to this podcast in higher education have some form of another of an active shooting playbook in case something occurs in their campus, right? And that's meant to give them the advantage of time. So speed is critical. Agility. Everything that you do in the earliest moments, in the earliest hours of a crisis may not land. So you really have to have this sort of always on ability to listen and understand how people are taking in the information. And if we get it wrong, we have to course correct. So for example, if you're the president and you're making the earliest comments, and then we're hearing the commentary on your comments, and it's running contrary to what we were trying to convey, we need to get back in there and get it right. So that's what we mean by agility, right? And then lastly is creativity. And people look at me often like I'm from another planet when I say creativity. But the best way to think about it is whoever has the best content generally wins the day. So even something as gruesome as this, or a factory explosion, or you pick the crisis, your ability to bring visual aids, just as an example, to help people kind of understand the campus, let's say. That we didn't see a lot of that on the Brown campus, but your sort of ability to explain the story with content that's rich and compelling. So let me just pause there. That's sort of the first take on some of the key things you got to get right.
Now, it's so true. I think that this notion of agility, transparency, speed, all of those, because the world is moving so very fast. And we've got Larry here. Larry, you're the expert I know that we've all done, as a university president, I've done a lot of tabletop exercises. What ifs? These are all the scenarios we have. But uh, tell me how you would have thought about handling this, or what kind of playbook do you have in hand for this type of an issue? I think that people will be very compelled to hear that.
Yeah, thanks, Gordon. At first, let me reiterate, the expression of sympathy and empathy for what's happening at Brown, for the victims, their families, as well as the community that's still responding to this. And you said two things in your intro that I wrote down, so I would not forget to come back to them. One is the real complexity of a campus and higher education in general right now, but the campus environment. And just to quickly, talk about Stony Brook, people say, we really run more like a small city, and that is the case. And Brown is similar in some ways because it is a campus within a local community, and we'll talk about some of the jurisdictional challenges in a moment. And the other thing you mentioned, the term you used was risk avoidance, and I'll push back just slightly on you with the use of that term, because I think as we built out our program here, and a lot of the things that I preach is really about resiliency, and it's not about avoidance. It's the opposite. It's about recognition and risk mitigation, which then brings me back to your question and the playbooks. And, can they have seen, was this able to be on their risk register? And the answer is simply yes. Higher ed, industry, government, it doesn't make a difference where, unfortunately, if you're not preparing for active shooter incidents or mass violence, you're certainly behind the curve. So Brown certainly had prepared and gamed these scenarios out. I think what's really come to the forefront is, at least for now, one of the major issues is around the CCTV and the surveillance video and what may have been captured or what might not have been captured, and what areas were under surveillance or should have been under surveillance. A lot of that I think will continue to play out as part of the investigation. But I can certainly tell you in a public campus, this delicate balance between creating a surveillance state and also being mindful of the open nature. Again, in a public university, we are an open campus here at Stony Brook. Brown is a little bit different. It's private property, but the ability to keep people safe and secure, use surveillance video both proactively during an incident for real-time intelligence, but more often perhaps as an archival evidentiary tool. And I really think you're seeing that play out in real time. Where the cameras are, the quality of the cameras. And when I talk about security, I liken it to the layers of an onion. And the middle layer of that onion, whatever it is what you're trying to protect. In the case of a campus, it's the students, faculty, staff. In our case, Stony Brook, it's our health system, it's the patients, it's the visitors. 50,000 people are the center of that onion. And the more layers we can put on that, the more protection we have, and in essence, the inherent risk mitigation that's there. Having CCTV in places and being valuable archival tools, fantastic. What I think Brown is seeing are the critics and unearned criticism from people who don't necessarily understand or know. It could be a big campus, a big building. You can't have a camera everywhere, and a lot of times it's not necessarily where you would like it to be. And then perhaps most importantly here is the quality of the video and the criticism about these grainy videos and things like that. A million questions. We could do a whole podcast on types of cameras and things like that. All that to say, this was absolutely on their risk register. They certainly have looked at these scenarios before. And I think we'll continue to learn more about where there might have been in gaps, if there are any, but perhaps more importantly, the value of electronic physical security or just technology in general as a force multiplier in keeping campuses and higher education institutions just safe and secure and more resilient.
Yeah, I think that I think what you're saying is so true, is the fact that we can never really anticipate what all the things we need. But I think what you're saying is that it's very important to make sure you learn from what has happened, but no one can really anticipate at that very, very point. Well, you've talked about the technical side, which is incredibly important, but Jeff, you need to talk about the communication side, because those two issues come in direct parallel relationship with each other and immediate, as a matter.
Yeah, and in fact, I mean, one of the things I've had the privilege of working with Larry and working to really understand reputational risk at Stony Brook. And one of the things that we did together was really drive home this notion that you can't separate reputational risk, from operational risk, that they need to be completely integrated. And yet we still see on a lot of campuses those not being integrated. You'll see very robust operational risk management and a lack of reputational risk, or vice versa. I think in this case, and I'm not the expert that Larry is, but you obviously have a fairly complex operating environment when it comes to communications, because you have the president, that needs to be, obviously active and stating a position, but you have the FBI, you have the local authorities. And, one of the things that we always stress in the earliest moments of a crisis is the earlier that we can get to what we would call the operating narrative. And by the way, that's going to change, but what, in the best way that we can, how can we articulate the facts as we know them today? And then the idea is that you want everybody to agree that that is the operating narrative. And in this case, it would be beyond Brown. It would be to the municipalities and the FBI. Are we all kind of coming from the same place? Again, from the outside looking in, that seemed a little bit disjointed, I'm sure, for many of the people that are watching this. That they didn't seem to really. You hear people say, "Well, they didn't have their act together," right? So any way that they could kind of get that kind of common operating narrative. The other thing that I would say, and I know this is going to sound a little bit simplistic, but it's never too early to imagine what life could look like on the other side of the crisis. And the reason we say that is because the sooner and the earlier that we can imagine that, it creates a much more efficient pathway to get leadership moving in a direction that aims to kind of put, the problem to rest, and to really kind of then recover, from the incident. So those are two things that I think, would be really critical. And then there's all the other, sort of normal stuff, the Q's and A's, and the frequency and the cadence of communications, how often. But I come back to those operating principles. You have to be able to convey transparency and authenticity, and you have to be very timely, in your communications. I'm sure, Larry, you would agree.
Yeah, Larry, I just say that the thing that struck me, and it struck me very often as the university president, when I was president of Ohio State, you're a big city within a bigger city. And so, and then when things would happen on the campus, the question was always, you don't want to say your own police are not competent. I'm talking about the campus police, but how do you coordinate all the various elements of this? In this instance, you have the campus police, you have the metropolitan police, you have from other venues, and then obviously you have the FBI. So it seems to me that is a critical component of this immediate response. Am I not right about that?
Yeah, that's 100% spot on. And I think what Jeff was alluding to a bit in the preparation, and we have worked so closely together. The development of the playbooks and the frameworks and the templates for what we say, how we say it, or what our response will be, is inclusive of not just messaging, but also that the coordination, which I put on the operational side. And if I had to sum it up in one word, I'd say it all comes down to relationships. And I can't speak for, what the local on the ground political relationships and the dynamics of the organizations, but Brown's dealing with the perfect storm of, a complexity of jurisdiction. In that, as you mentioned, Gordon, yes, campus police, they have an accredited police department, and they have, investigatory abilities, but they have the city of Providence, and if it's being investigated as terrorism and/or a mass shooting, and the jurisdiction of the FBI and ATF, and another element of complexity, and that is the case here. So you have jurisdictional boundaries, and then of course you have just the human factors and the personalities. And I can tell you, coming up on my almost 30th year in law enforcement, there's a lot of type A personalities and people who are well-intentioned and want to do, a great job, especially under the circumstances. Victims and families want to identify suspects and want someone held accountable. The challenge with that is that things start to move fast, and if all of those pieces operationally, legally, and as Jeff pointed out, from a communications perspective, if they're not aligned, then you wind up with, which will be the title of the latest column on Penning, credibility in a crisis. And once you lose credibility, I think that's where some of the challenging questions are coming from reporters. But you said this, but you said that, and now things are moving so fast. And I think the municipal law enforcement as well as the federal partners are trying to parse it out. Having had the sit down, he always said you don't want to be exchanging business cards over the hood of a car at the scene of whatever XYZ incident. I don't know if that's the case here or not, but we at Stony Brook and former places have spent a ton of time meeting in advance, coordinating, collaborating, both officially and unofficially, networking. You have to be able to be comfortable with each other, the organizations, and trust each other. And to be able to go back to what the frameworks are, what does our playbook say? What are our priorities? How do we continue to advance our institutional values at a time where we're being stressed to the limit? Are we nimble? And our ability to say, as Jeff said, I think one of the most important tenets is transparency. Sometimes having a press conference just to have a press conference, that's a strategy. But not being able to have information timely is a strategy that could work against you. Having an investigation that's unfolding so rapidly that you think you're going one direction, and we saw this with a person of interest identified and in custody, and then that person is released and not in custody. All of those things just add to the existing complexity, and trying to have the right person behind the mic at the podium really adds for just the utmost in complexity.
Yeah, don't you think? Yeah, go ahead, please.
So, Gordon, you mentioned you've done a lot of tabletops, and there's a distinction between tabletops and perhaps more elaborate simulations. Larry and I have been involved with both. But one of the things that you very rarely see is a tabletop or a wider simulation that actually involves law enforcement on the reputation side. Now, you will see it in natural disaster drills, for example, that sort of integration. But I would suggest that's one of the things that we're going to learn coming out of this is that we really need to integrate more people into these exercises that we're doing and into our playbooks, and that we're not meeting some of these people for the first time, when the crisis has occurred.
Yeah, I think that both of you are saying the same thing, and that is that you have to be anticipatory with trust. You have to build that trust. You need to know your special agents who are in your neighborhood. You need to know the police chief. You need to, and I think particularly universities and particularly certain kind of institutions, there's kind of this antagonism between the local police and between the university police. University police are first and foremost psychiatrists. You're dealing with 18, 19-year-olds. You're dealing with kids who may make a mistake. You do not want their life to be ruined by making a dumb mistake. On the other hand, very often the local police, and I see this now in Morgantown, as just one example, they're very monotheistic. It's black and white, and you're either right or you're either wrong. And that comes into serious conflict if you're a university president. I think that's important. Anyway, I appreciate the fact that we now have a technical side of it that we're trying to understand, and we have a communication side, and the fact that they're being brought together in some appropriate way. So, I for one just want to say that I've had 45 years of experience on this, and I'll just give you a quick view because before we started this podcast, Jeff asked me, well, what would you do? I don't think that there's a definitive answer. I think that there's a lot of instinct with this. The one thing that I do know as a university leader, as a leader of any of these kind of situations, you have to be very immediate. You have to be very personal. The personalization of these issues are very important. You have to care. You have to be seen as caring. You have to meaningfully care. I think about 9/11. I was the chancellor of Vanderbilt at the time, and happened early in the morning. I was giving a speech. I rushed right back to the campus. People were in shock, and I just walked around and just said, we're going to get over this. We're going to be there. I slept on the the student, in the student union. I slept on the floor for 3 or 4 days. The personalization of these events from the leadership point of view, you have to have the technical expertise. So you got Larry. You have to have the communication expertise. You've got Jeff. You have to have a leadership profile and role of someone at the institution who can really speak up and speak out. I was very fortunate, by the way, that we had a young woman there who really stepped up. She was Palestinian. Think about that. And her, in fact, her aunt was Hannah Sarari, who was the spokesman for the Palestinian cause. But yet she stepped up and took a leadership role with me to really define this issue as an issue that we're all going to learn from, and that it's not Fortress America, it's us learning from each other. And I think that you have to constantly look over the horizon. You can breathe, you can do everything else because you're going to, but having that ability to look beyond this and learn, and I love what both Jeff and Larry are saying, is the fact that you can prepare yourself, you can have all the bells and whistles available, but in the end, I just wrote down some words: trust, relationships, resiliency, transparency, creativity, speed. I think that if we were to sum up what we're trying to do right now, I would think that that's probably as good a playbook as we could possibly have. So anyway, I welcome Jeff. Larry, tell us a little bit. Any final thoughts before we conclude?
Well, Gordon, I thought one of the things that might be helpful is for Larry and I both to kind of anticipate what might come next.
Yeah.
So when we look at these crisis situations in general, you as soon as you can, you want to start thinking about, closure. How do you get closure of the crisis, and then how do you get recovery? How do you get brand recovery? So we went through, with Penn State, and I think there's 4 things that have to happen on the journey to recovery, and the first thing is a full accounting of the facts. And so you will not recover until you get the fullest accounting of what happened that you can. So you may not be able to tell me everything right now, but at some point, the expectation is that you will be able to, and that you will tell me. The second thing is there's an expectation of what you're doing to prevent this from happening again, mitigating the crisis, right? That's an expectation. The third thing, and this is really important to understand as early in the crisis as possible, is to understand that there's going to be a look back, meaning that there will be a report card or a grade issued on how you comported yourself and how you handled the crisis in the moment. And you can't avoid that. But there will be that whole question of what did they know? When did they know it? What did they do based on what they know? And again, the earlier you have mindful of that, in a crisis, the better, because it dictates you doing the right thing at that moment. And then the final thing is, what are you doing to pass the learning on to others so that they might, be able to kind of like either avoid this or, go through it in a smoother fashion. So for example, the reason we have tamper-proof packaging is because of Tylenol. And the reason that we have double-hulled tankers is because of Exxon Valdez. So somehow, what can Brown teach the world of things? And that obviously would require, and I'm sure Larry will get into this, a good post review of what actually happened. And Larry, you may have some other thoughts of what you think will happen operationally.
And you set me up perfectly. So I'll take the moniker of, and we have emergency communication standards on campus because of Virginia Tech. And in a lot of ways, I'm here sitting in this chair because of Virginia Tech. And post Virginia Tech review and ultimately the fines that were levied against them based on some identified gaps in their emergency communications, that was a turning point for higher education and how they managed crises. And that was 2008. And then the position that I had 5 positions ago was created. And that's what drew me from municipal law enforcement to come back here to Stony Brook in 2009. I think this could be another Virginia Tech moment in the sense that, and we've had, unfortunately, plenty of other examples of campus shootings and incidents, but this is a series of events, and we don't know, the MIT shooting still obviously being investigated, some speculation about, is there a connection? Is there not a connection? I'm not suggesting that there is or isn't. But I do think that there could be some new standards and some new benchmarks in that this is what the expectation is for physical security or just a global security picture. And I'll go back to what we preach all the time: a holistic, non-siloed global enterprise approach. Not just because it's what I do in my title, but I really do feel strongly about it. And Jeff will say, inculcating that culture. We use the same terminology: inculcating a risk-aware, holistic approach to risk management, risk mitigation. And it's in every aspect. And it's not just one or two. We may be the risk owners in some things, but we're like the control tower, and we're the people who make sure the right people are around the table. They have plans. They're practicing those plans. They're identifying gaps in advance, but certainly after an incident happens, and there'll be a lot of takeaways. And I hope, and I'm sure that those takeaways will be memorialized, and those will become, future plans and modifications to existing policies and procedures and practices.
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, let me tell you something. We're right in the middle of this. I thought it was very important for us to get together and talk about it, because people take solace from knowing that people are thinking about this, number one. Number two, I think that there is the possibility that even now we can learn a great deal from what is happening and how we can mitigate, how we can move forward. The most important thing is that knowledge is power, and the knowledge that we're providing in some way or other. And what's interesting to me is I'm sitting here talking to the two of you. Both of you have very clear, distinctive abilities to be able to figure out what is happening, but they parallel each other. And I think that there's a great lesson here about the organic nature of crises, and how one cannot have just the police on one hand, or just university or any institution on the other hand. You've got to really integrate as quickly as you possibly can. And that comes back to speed, which I think is very important. So we're going to do this again. We're going to talk about other kinds of things. Our pop-up podcast is in the books, and we're grateful that we've had a chance to share a few thoughts at a time, which is very challenging nationally, and we hope that we're being of some help. So everyone have a good day.